Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure and delight of having a chance to speak with the one and only Sanduni yet again. I can never speak to her too much, and it's a thrill to have a chance to speak with her again. Sanduni, I hope you're doing well.
Good, thank you, Daniel. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. We're running around. We're getting ready for all the different things that need to be done, and it's all coming together. But Sanduni, I always enjoy a chance to speak with you. What are the things you've been thinking about? What's been on your mind? What are topics of interest, so on and so forth?
Oh, there have been too many topics on my mind, especially inspired by thoughts and the conflict of the mind and all the articles and happy emails you keep spamming all your listeners with. So, yes, mainly I've been going down a rabbit hole about moral hypocrisy.
Mm.
And I remember we exchanged a few emails on the topic too. So I thought we could talk about morality and moral hypocrisy. Um, Preferably, well, I've only read about Kant's theory and the categorical imperative as a subject of discussing morality. And I got a limited edition of the Harvard Classics of Plato's Republic. So I've been reading that lately, and I was thinking we could have a discussion comparing the two of those. Yeah. I mean, yes, morality is, the set of principles that guide us in our interactions with others and our decision-making processes, but it is also an essential part of human behavior. And that is something that helps us distinguish between the right and wrong, obviously. Now, having said that, a question that's been on my mind, and I always come back to you with questions because, I enjoy picking your brain and you always have so much to say about it. Now, when we talk about morality and hypocrisy, or just morality on its own, could we refer to it as an emotion? And if so, do you think emotion rules over reason at times?
I think certainly emotion can rule over reason. It doesn't follow that that's necessarily bad, because you can also have reason rule over emotion in a manner that destroys emotions and turns us all into lifeless robots or something, right? So the question becomes, how does emotion and reason inform one another? Also, often we'll call emotion maybe a decision that we have from the gut. There's research that shows there are neurons in the gut, and that the gut can actually be a very good source of insight. At the same time, people can take that too far and just say, oh, well, I felt it in my gut that I should do X, and they don't put it through any sort of conceptual mediation or skepticism, and their gut leads them to jumping off a cliff, quote unquote. So there's always this problem. Likewise, people can be so sure about their reasonable structure of what is right or wrong, that then they don't actually compare it with lived experience, and as a result, they fall into a conceptual structure that's internally consistent, but actually leads to a lot of trouble. So what we seem to say, I would say generally in the history of moral thought, and you could also make distinctions between, say, morality and ethics. So for example, morality might be an individual's code of activity, while ethics is social. So for example, maybe you have a morality where you think it's wrong to, say, sit in somebody's chair if there's a coat draped over it, but there's no ethics in a legal sense that says you shouldn't do that, even if there are perhaps social customs that say you shouldn't do this. So the topic is interesting, for one, because you have all these different potential categorizations, right, between what we're talking about. So another example, if I say, hey, tomorrow let's meet at the Big T for lunch at 2:00, it now becomes wrong for me not to be there at 2:00 tomorrow, but we wouldn't say that it was, say, illegal for me not to be there at 2:00 tomorrow. And maybe we would say, we may even say that it's not unethical because it's not socially encoded in some sort of golden tablet somewhere that I must be there on time. But we might say it's immoral unless I have a really good reason. For example, I'm in a car wreck, or I get really, really sick, right? So what's very interesting is right there, though, you see conditionality. You and I agree to a certain behavior that is right, given certain conditions, right? I'm not sick, I'm not in a car wreck, something doesn't reasonably come up. Oh, well, wait a minute, reasonably, the moment you use the word reasonably, there's a judgment there. What would constitute a valid condition versus a condition that is not valid, right? Well, then we have to judge and we have to assess that, and only we in our particular situation could know that. So if we take someone like Kant that wants to say, let's say, don't do anything that you wouldn't want everyone to be doing, right? The categorical imperative. And you could even say you wouldn't want everyone doing all the time, although the time variable might be debatable there. Okay, let's say murder. We wouldn't want everyone murdering all the time, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, is stepping on an ant murder? Well, maybe to some traditions or like Buddhist thinking, you shouldn't, all sentient life has a certain value. But a lot of people would say, well, that's killing, but that's not murder, right? Maybe you're killing, but it's not murder. Okay, well, that's interesting because there's the loss of a life. And yet we would agree that there seems to be a difference between murder and killing, right? Well, how do you tell the difference? Well, it would require the conditions of the particular situation to tell, right? A lot of people would say that if somebody's breaking into your house trying to steal something and you shot them in the leg, that would not be the same as, say, shooting them in the leg just randomly one day, right? Okay, well, there's a certain condition, same action, but a differentiation on conditions, right? So the first thing, and that also, a lot of people say, oh, are you saying ethic, morality? And I'm going to use the terms a little more conflated off and on. I might make distinctions, but I don't think at this point we need to hold hard distinctions between the terminology. But if I were to say, oh, are you saying that ethics is relative then? No, because murder is always wrong under all conditions. The issue is that we don't always agree on what killing falls under the category of murder, right? So I like to call that absolute moral conditionality. Murder is always wrong, but the conditions of what constitute murder are not always at play in every situation of killing, right? So part of the issue, actually, the first thing I would say is that actually, in my opinion, a lot of classical ethical texts, including, say, Kant, including Plato, including a lot, actually, they speak about morality as very, very general, when even if the categories of morality are indeed objective and always the case, it is not necessarily, knowing that murder is always wrong is not necessarily the same as the knowledge of what killing falls under the category of murder. And actually, you mentioned hypocrisy. A lot of times, people will be accused of hypocrisy because they don't, by someone who does not follow their judgments of what constitute, say, murder. To them, it was just killing, but to the other persons, it's murder. So when you say, oh, murder is wrong, you're a hypocrite now. Well, no, I didn't agree to those conditions, right? I didn't agree to that definition. So you have here, I think, actually, we basically, Sanduni, the first thing I'd say is I think a lot of our ethical reasoning has not been very sophisticated because we haven't thought of of conditionalism. We haven't thought that you can have objectively right or wrong moral categories, and yet at the same time, have disagreement on what conditions fall under those categories or not. We've either been very objective, oh, it's always right or wrong, it's clear a day, or we've been very relativistic, where, oh, it's all just your opinion and all just your taste. We've not really had much moral thinking in terms of conditionality. And that, of course, then becomes very difficult because how do you judge the conditions? What are the conditions? What are the standards of the conditions? And things like that. And so that would be the first thing I'd say is thinking the difference between objectivity, relativism, and conditionalism. And really what we see is, I think what we have to do is think conditionalism.
Yes, I think that's very good. When you talk about conditionalism and being realism, I think about Kant's theory, the categorical imperative, where he relies, or rather emphasizes, on the concept of autonomy. Now, we live in a very conflicted society where a sense of autonomy can almost be threatening. And not to sort of relatively compare the theories between Kant and Plato discusses the noble lie that he believes if it's for the greater good, you might as well do that. But having said that, how do we apply this in the modern world we live in? Because what is the sense of autonomy with, having all these institutions that run our lives and, Google keeping tabs on our information? There is no privacy. And I think it's almost very easy to be hypocritical. Whereas back in the day when this was written, there was a sense of being noble and righteous in defining the concept of moral hypocrisy. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, what has happened here? So we made this distinction between morality being more individual and ethics being more social. Well, in the past, before pluralism, if you were, say, born in America, it was likely the case that your society operated according to Christianity, and you were probably individually a Christian. So the ethical and the moral tended to overlay quite a lot. And likewise, it was probably a fair bet that the people around you shared your worldview. And so they could fairly determine if you are a hypocrite or not, because you claim to be a Christian and you said you loved your neighbor as yourself, and they agreed to that same definition of morality and ethical standing, and they had the same definition of who constituted the neighbor. So they could probably fairly assess if you were being a hypocrite or not, because you shared that immanent frame, you shared that framework, right? The more we have moved into pluralism, globalization, and so on and so forth, the more and more there's been a division where you cannot assume that the ethics of a society overlays so much with the morality of a society. And in fact, they might be totally opposite. And then you're dealing with other nations that have their own divisions and differences there, right? So that creates quite a bunch of issues, because also to say in the past, let's say you're in a Christian society and you don't really talk a whole lot about, say, some of the more difficult theological concepts of Christianity, such as the notion of the Trinity, right? Well, it wouldn't really so much be a lie. It would just be a holding back, because that was a concept that was something that was more difficult for people to understand, right? You could withhold and it not be a lie, because if someone, say, rose to the place where they could handle those theological concepts, you could give it to them, right? So there was kind of like a hold back, give, and so on. And also, like, for example, you could follow that with more intense moral life, right? You know, the things that Jesus says are arguably impossible for an individual to follow. So you may hold back some of the more intense moral teachings of Jesus until someone is 40 years old, and then introduce it to them and let them grow and develop, right? Well, today what ends up happening, if everyone has access to the internet and they have access to the full schema of theology, or all these different sermons and then all these other different religions, people then know when things are being held back from them. And so it can feel like people are lying to you when they might just be kind of holding back, right? So you have that confusion going on being able to tell the difference between a lie and just holding back. And then people also feeling entitled to say no everything all the time. Also, if you have a globalized world where, say, you know that your governments are, say, treating the Chinese a certain way, or they're doing certain things in Western nations regarding terrorism, then you feel like you are part of that and you should have a say in that, even if you don't necessarily have all the information that the government has, right? So then that feels like you're being deceived, when really it could simply be the case that unless you are, say, working in the depths of government, you simply just don't have all the information to you, right? So the first thing to be said is drawing the distinction between necessary holding back and a noble lie is today really hard to identify. All of those things kind of blur together, right? Now, also with a noble lie, the whole concept of a noble lie is telling someone something because they're not prepared to know the whole thing, where if you told them the whole thing too early, it may destroy them or it may cause social collapse, right? So the other great thinker on this is like Leo Strauss, who will talk about hysteric readings, where philosophers would write hysterically simply because if everyone knew all of the depths of philosophical reasoning, say the impossibility of grounding metaphysical values, then they would stop being, well, what's the point of being ethical if we can't ground it in anything, if we can't ground anything objective, and therefore they would stop being ethical, right? So the philosopher would write hysterically because if the average person knew that, the whole social order could collapse, right? Is it indeed? And so you'd have this problem where only people who say we're ready to learn of the impossibility of grounding metaphysical values could learn that without it destroying them. And therefore you might lie, quote unquote, or just not fully unveil the fact that that metaphysical grounding can't be the case, right? But notice here, the context of a noble lie is not a lie for a lie's sake. It is indeed tied to this concept we were saying earlier of holding back, precisely because the fullness would have destructive consequences, right? So that even gets into the idea is if I tell everyone X and people knowing X leads to incredible misery, isn't indeed it kind of noble not to tell everyone X or to word it in an hysteric manner, right? What we see here is one of the reasons why moral kind of generalities and moral categories can be problematic, because it's always trade-offs, right? Like if everyone learns the truth, well, they may respond to the truth in a manner that tears down the social order. And as a result, the economy doesn't work, poverty goes up, people don't have kids, or the family unit doesn't work, and so on and so forth, right? So there's always trade-offs that to be taken into play. And often what ends up happening is in thinkers like Kant, And Plato's a little better because he's often talking about the Republic, so he has more of a sense of the difference between the social and the individual. Kant is certainly talking from an Enlightenment tradition that's going to put a whole lot of emphasis on individual decisions of right and wrong, right? And so for him, like where he's going to be emphasizing only do what you would want done to others at all circumstances, like the categorical imperative, that doesn't really leave a lot of room for trade-offs, right? Trade-offs between different decisions. And it certainly does not leave room for thinking about trade-offs in pluralistic situations, where people don't even share the same framework, where, like, so for example, Burden Shaw, he was a great writer, playwright, and he said, don't always, the problem with doing unto others what you want done to yourself might be that they don't like it. Like if you love your neighbor, as yourself, well, what if they have a different definition of love, right? Maybe what you find loving, they find hateful, and they don't appreciate it, right? So the moment you introduce that possible hermeneutical difference, notions like Kant's categorical imperative are going to prove very inadequate. They're going to be generally true to help you establish a category, but it will not be useful to determine what falls under that category or what are the conditions for falling under that category, right? And so for example, if you would like to know the truth, then be sure to always tell people the truth, right? Well, what if you're dealing with people that don't understand the truth, right? Or you're dealing with people of whom that truth would actually hurt, right? Well, right there, you see the categorical imperative can be very, very problematic. And there's a long tradition of this, and then I'll give it back to you. Augustine in the City of God will talk about the splendid vices, where there are certain vices that actually God can use in pagan societies to bring about positive changes in terms of Christianity. And right there, you see a conditionalism, something that is a vice under 99% of circumstances, if used in terms of providence and grace, can actually suddenly be used for the bringing about of God's glory, right? Not because he required the vice, but because there's a certain condition that can change the meaning of the vice. And so you have something more complex going on, is I think what we're pointing at.
That's all very good, Daniel. As always, you're very insightful. I think when you talk about Kant's categorical imperative, at his time, clearly, we didn't live in a very distinguished society as we do now, because the sense of autonomy is almost a mutual concept where everyone is the same. But that isn't so the case anymore. And I think the idea that we have the ability to govern ourselves and make our own decisions is something that modern society really thrives on. Now, that obviously blurs what morality is and what are the values that one must have in order to live in that society. And I think Kant also believed that we have a duty to respect the autonomy of others. And that is true, that very much still exists now. Having said that, the theory of the fact that we should treat them as the ends in themselves rather than as a means to our own ends is not so much the case anymore.
Sure.
And obviously Kant's moral philosophy can be summarized in three main formulations of the categorical imperative: the formula of universal law, humanity, and the kingdom of ends, right?
Sure.
So it brings up what you said about Christianity and loving your neighbor and all of that. But having said that, this formulation sort of requires us to consider how our actions would affect the hypothetical kingdom of ends. And I don't think where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, while we promote and, strive to have these values, to a certain extent, it's also been diminished in modern society. And I think that is one of the main problems when we talk about moral hypocrisy. It's almost hypocritical because what you're advocating for is very much what does not exist in modern society. And I think that was one of the many striking points that I came across when I was comparing Kant and Plato, and how that's what drove me down the rabbit hole, really. And I thought, you could give me some insight on that. Having said that, now we talk about reason and, whether emotion rules over reason. Would you say modern society lacks reason and it's purely ruled by emotion that people think is reason? Because reasons vary. Having said that, there's always a reason behind everything, but it's mostly driven by an emotion rather than an actual cause. Whereas back in the day, these theories were sort of formulated to actually come to an understanding of our existence.
So those are wonderful questions. First off, I would say that we're the worst of all possible mixtures, where we're either autonomously emotional or autonomously rational, and we're not dialectical between them. It actually comes to speak on this problem of Kant. So, for example, what the issue is that in a pluralistic world, what constitutes treating the other with dignity is not self-evident. Because even if you are doing what relative to your worldview is dignity, the other person may not agree, then they are hurt, and then they respond with hurt, and then it goes back and forth, right? It's like Gary Chapman's love languages on marriage, where if you have one person whose love language is gifts and the other person is talking, then that person gives you a gift and you're like, why are you giving me a gift? I couldn't care less, which to them is an expression of love. And then you don't give them a gift because you think gifts are materialistic, but to them that's an act of love. And so then there's a lot of hurt, but nobody says anything because they believe that with there's also this thing where if you feel like if you have to explain what you define as love to the other person, they don't really love you because they should just get it, right? There's something about the human being that feels like their way of interpreting the world is something that the people around them should just get. And also, they may not have even been trained to be able to explain their worldview and why they do the things they want to do. So they may not even be capable of engaging in that explanation, right? So then you get a lot of misunderstanding, right? So when I say, for example, we should treat everyone with dignity and respect, the problem is that to everyone who hears that, they go, okay, I know exactly what that means. The problem is that what exactly that means can be different between people. In Kant's day, generalities such as treat everyone with dignity and respect everyone's autonomy was much more clear. And even though there would have been some degree of hermeneutical differences, they wouldn't have been blatant, right? They wouldn't have been extreme. Maybe there's differences between the Baptist and the Methodist and the Catholic, but that's not going to be as extreme as between, say, the Catholic and the Hindu or the atheist, right? As you go more and more into a pluralized, globalized world, where also you have increasing internet connectability with different people, right? Then things that to you equal treating people with respect and dignity and respecting their autonomy, to them is to not care about them. Yeah, so what you'll see in marriages is that people will do what they think is self-evident to them as an act of love, that to the other person is not an act of love, and then they get hurt because they're doing their best to help the other person, the other isn't, and there's all these different problems, right? It's funny because the problems of hermeneutics tend to really come out in proximity. When people live together all the time, then they didn't, when they were dating, they didn't see all these hermeneutical issues. But then when they're together all the time, then it starts to come up and they have to figure out how to negotiate those, talk through those things and live with it, right? Well, the more and more we have a global village and the internet and globalization bring everyone together, then everyone is constantly in proximity with one another, right? And basically, what do they always say about a marriage? It doesn't work unless you have communication. Right? The ability to kind of talk about things and to go through things and so on and so forth. Well, basically, that's what's happening now is in a globalized world, there has to be a perpetual communication about how they interpret what you believe is an ethical action, but they don't think it is, and back and forth and so on and so forth. The problem is a lot of moral theory does not bring with it an emphasis on the need to communicate in the space of that moral theory. It basically is like just respect people's autonomy, right? Respect people's individuality. Yeah, but the way you think is respecting autonomy, they interpret as indifference and that you don't care about them. No, I'm just giving you space to be yourself. No, you're just not creating community, right? And so they're hurt, then they're upset, everything feels atomized and stuff goes to crap, right? So the issue is that what you have to do today, you have someone like Habermas who emphasizes communicative rationality, the necessity of perpetual sort of conversation to sort of understand the terms of ethical action. That perpetually becomes necessary today, but all we've been taught is don't kill people, be nice, respect autonomy. Those are not the skills of conversation. Like now what you're seeing in pluralization and globalization is ethics requires basically the skills of a diplomat. Like you can read someone like a Huntington or a Kissinger when he's talking about having conversations with Mao, being like college professors to understand worldview. And someone like Kissinger in his book On China and World Order is really going to emphasize that diplomacy is impossible without an effort to negotiate and converse in terms of different worldviews. So like if you want to understand China, you got to read the Red March, Journey to the West, the Three Kingdoms. You got to read these literatures to know where people is coming from. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble. The issue is that the average person is increasingly finding themselves living as if the diplomat, as in that same sort of world of all these different hermeneutical structures, and all they have to deal with it is catechol imperative, kingdom of ends, these generalities that don't teach them how to talk through those generalities to know how other people understand them. Because basically, and actually then the horror of that, and then I'll give it back to you, is if in your mind you go, okay, we want to respect everyone's autonomy, right? And people who don't respect people's autonomy are immoral, right? They're doing what's wrong, right? And we want to create a kingdom of ends where everyone's autonomy is respected, right? Well, according to your, say, perhaps conservative definition of what constitutes respecting autonomy, liberals are not respecting autonomy, therefore they are immoral, therefore you are justified to treat them differently to stop that immorality, and now we start getting totalitarianism. Now we start getting oppression in the name of good, which again is basically inevitable for ethics to do if it does not take seriously that under globalization especially, communicative rationality, as Habermas puts it, must be at the very center of ethical life. And that has not been, for most people's thinking, what they've had to do. And frankly, today, most moral theorists, which I think today you basically need a kind of almost new way of thinking about ethics, they're just doing thought experiments about trolleys, or maybe they're talking about animal rights like a Peter Singer, all of which is fine, but we're not really thinking through what does it mean if the average person has to morally reason like a diplomat, like they have to reason like someone like that. That has not been taught. We have not thought about that. And we also, colleges have tried to deal with the problem of various ethics by just relativizing it all and just saying, oh, ethics is relative. That's not going to work. And the reason that will not work is because the moment I choose to do X instead of Y, I believe it's good to do X instead of Y. All of us must operate according to a moral system. We cannot avoid it. And if we just say that, oh, everyone has their own opinion on what is the moral system, well, then the name of the game of who rules is power. All that's left is power then. Who can get the power first and who can impose their moral order on other people? And even if you say, well, no, we just say that we don't have power. Someone has to win the election. Someone has to write the laws. And so it's going to fall into power, really. And so we really are, by not taking this strong connection between communicative rationality and ethics seriously, we're leading ourselves into a world where all there is power. Power rules the day, and force and violence, unfortunately. So it's quite dire.
Thank you, Daniel. I think the example of, negotiating like a diplomat was quite apt, because it reminds me of Hegel's theory of hypocrisy, how he saw hypocrisy as a form of self-deception that can be harmful, and argued that the only way to overcome it is through, the development of ethical character, which requires individuals to a certain extent to internalize the moral law and make it a part of their being. Now, you also talked about marriage and the ability to communicate. So do you think we lack moral hypocrisy because of our ability, or rather the lack of, to compromise and negotiate? Because where do you draw the line? Where do you sort of decide what are the moral beliefs? What is the sense of morality in the day that we live in? And I think it also reminds me of Rousseau's social contract, where he compares morality to desire, and distinguishing between desire and our needs. And I think, we often talk about desire in our discussions, you with Michelle, and I think it plays a huge role. It's such a broad theme when you discuss all of these other concepts. And I think Rousseau argued that individuals often act in ways that are contrary to their true desires in order to conform to societal expectations. Yes. And I think that is very true. Now more than ever, we all have this. I mean, what is diplomacy? You advocate for things that you do or do not believe in, but, it's all about getting it done. And I think that example, it really reflects what moral hypocrisy is, especially if you look at politics in the current times. Yeah, what are your views on the social contract? Do you think, I think definitely Hegel and Rousseau's concept of moral hypocrisy is realistic and more applicable now than Kant and Plato's?
No, that's a very good question. So generally speaking, I'm quite Humean on the point that any effort to found social legitimacy on a hypothetical scenario or a contract that people, quote unquote, signed by voting in a certain location is an attempt to philosophically found a society, which automatically means you're dealing with a philosophical state, which then is prone to totalitarianism, just like Hume put forth. The foundation for a social order must be the common life, not a philosophical basis. So what Hume warns about with the social contract theory is if you go, oh, we all agree to certain legitimacies of the state because we live in American borders, you can say that it's a choice, but it's not really, because can you really get up and move to, say, Africa? You don't know the culture, you don't know the language, you don't know anything. So for him, it's a kind of sleight of hand where you're claiming that people chose the social contract, but technically they do because they could move, but practically they don't because they're kind of forced to ascribe to it. And the reason he says this is dangerous is because it then legitimizes whatever the government wants to do. Like if they say you must pay 10% higher taxes because, you know, you chose to live here and that's what we agreed on, it becomes kind of a blank check for basically the power structures to do what they want to do. Furthermore, social contracts tend to be based on state of nature thought experiments. So in Rousseau, you know, society, everywhere man is in chains, and in nature, things were perfect. So then you design the social contract in terms of getting back to that state of nature. Well, there never was a state of nature like that. It's just a hypothetical basis of what you think constitutes human nature. And that, of course, is a philosophical basis for the formation of the state, which just happens to align with your worldview. So then you have one person's worldview becomes instantiated through a thought experiment into law that then everyone has to follow, even if they disagree, right? So all social contracts are quite dangerous, actually. I much prefer just speaking about law or speaking about constitution, not a social contract. Because the moment you talk about a social contract, unless by that, here's the thing, you can make a distinction between social contract and custom. Custom is very valid, right? And you can even talk about like where you have, like, for example, you have a society where everyone there agrees to help someone build a barn if their barn gets burned down, right? It's not written into law anywhere, but it's also not based on like a social contract, which is a philosophical treatise. It's simply based on the facticity that building a barn is necessary in an agricultural society, and your barn was burned down. Therefore, you need a new barn. Therefore, your neighbor, out of common life and sentiment, as Hume would put it, will come and help you, right? So for David Hume, you can basically get all the benefits of a social contract simply on the common life itself, right? And so this is going to be much more communitarian. This is certainly going to be much smaller government sort of thinking. But for Hume, he's like, what is the use of the social contract other than to legitimize a Leviathan state or some large state to impose its will upon smaller localities to then force them to conform to something that they must not want to conform to, because otherwise they would simply do it without the social contract, right? And so then what ends up happening is the social contract gets mixed up with, say, big claims of what the federal government exists to do, but then love your neighbor. And, you know, you should pay taxes at 20% and you should take care of orphans. Well, all these things get mixed together now. And David Hume would say, like, some of those things are not part of the social contract. That's just part of common life and sentiment, right? But you're claiming it's part of the social contract, which then makes the rest of what the government wants to do seem legitimate, because it's including in its action things that people would naturally do that now the state is acting like people won't naturally do without that social contract, right? So there's a lot of things that get mixed up. And so for people of like the Scottish Enlightenment, and I agree with them, the social contract is relatively useless and actually dangerous as a way of thinking. Now, if you want to write a constitution that gives rise to a process of how you pass amendments and what are those amendments, for example, private property will be respected. Well, that's a law, right? And you would say, well, what's the legitimacy of that law? You could say a social philosophical contract, such as man have a right to property. David Hume would be like, no, we don't need a philosophical basis for it. If you don't have private property, you can't function. Nobody will take care of anything. There won't be any streets. You won't have any businesses. People will be stealing things. You literally will not have a functioning society without private property, right? So the basis of private property becomes the raw facticity of common experience and phenomenology, not a philosophical basis that is just begging. What ends up happening with that is then you get into totalization, which then leads into total war or conflict with other nations. Because if you say, for example, democracy is the best form of government, okay, according to your definition of democracy, well, if that's based on philosophy, that's not just bound to America. That has to be spread to the whole world, okay? Well, then you get the Middle East, then you get China, then you get all these disagreements in different cultures where people butt up against one another, right? Because a philosophically based society is not bound to just that society. If it's a philosophical basis, it applies to human nature, not just American nature. Well, now we start getting into all the misunderstandings. Then all of the stuff we were saying earlier happens in marriage, and now it's happening between nations. So the first thing I would say is that the social contract lends in that direction, right? And then also on the language of hypocrisy, the state can actually use the claim that people are being hypocrites to control them when that hypocrisy is defined according to the social contract, right? So the other issue with hypocrisy is that there's a way to weaponize it to conform other people to what you think they are doing. But then there's a form of hypocrisy that is checking and balancing yourself to make sure that you're actually living up to your own standard, right? And often what you'll see is that it's almost more useful to think about you yourself being a hypocrite as opposed to looking at other people being hypocrites. Because when you're looking at other people, then you might be having hermeneutical differences that are not being taken accounted for. Where if you look at yourself, because you are the one in all of the particular situations where you are making these decisions, you are more likely to see if you to accurately assess if you are consistently holding to your own moral standard between all those situations, or if in fact you're being a hypocrite, right? And so there are also here, so there's a few things on the topic of hypocrisy. One, the possibility of hypocrisy being used by a state to control people. Two, hypocrisy as something you see in other people, which can then be problematic. And then three, hypocrisy that you see in yourself, right? And so those things have to be worked through. And I think basically the way to most successfully navigate all of that is probably going to be on moral theory that's more based on common life and facticity as opposed to a social contract, because a social contract tends to be too vague, too non-conditioned by which to meaningfully arrive at assessments of hypocrisy that actually just aren't in service of some vision that might be totalitarian.
Thank you, Daniel. That was all very well said, as always. Now, I was also thinking about the sense of duty when it comes to moral law, and how over time, the sense of duty towards community, to society, to family has changed the way it carries. You know, I mean, Hegel especially talks about it in the phenomenology of mind. You know, he explores a sense of duty, and, you know, duty is what leads to creating a moral law, or rather acknowledging it. And, you know, we always talk about subjectivity and objectivity in our discussions, and how it's important to sort of have this clear chain of thoughts about these matters. Now then, when we discuss duty, sense of duty varies with, you know, the part of community you're from, where you're from. Like you said, you know, politically countries are different, have different values, ideologies. So how do we define moral law then?
That's a great question. I think ultimately what we see is a movement from something like a social contract to something more like a
communicative contract. And what I mean by that is the following. You know, Wittgenstein had this we talked about language games, where the way that we communicate is like language. It's almost like a game. You agree on the meaning of the terms and then you use it from there, right? Well, there's something to be said about a kind of ethical game that's like the Wittgenstein language game. So, for example, if I say tomorrow, I'm going to pick you up to take you to the train station at 2 p.m., meet me here. Well, if you say yes, then you agree to that framing of your day tomorrow, and therefore you not being there at 2 p.m. is wrong, and in a very real sense, immoral, because you agree to these terms, and I've made sacrifices to realize it, unless you have very, very good reason. So we create a situation, we talk to one another, we agree on the meaning of the terms, we negotiate, we say, okay, when you say the train station, do you mean the Virginia train station or the DC train station? We agree on the terms. And then based on that shared intelligibility, determine what would constitute right action at 2 p.m. tomorrow versus wrong action at 2 p.m. tomorrow, right? Because of that shared intelligibility, right? The issue that we find today is we can no longer assume shared intelligibility in pluralism and globalization. And this also is increasingly occurring within nations because of diversity that's happening within nations, right? Again, if you're dealing in a Christian society, it's reasonable to assume that the shared intelligibility is relatively given, right? But it's not given anymore. And then thinking in terms of social contracts and duty and all of that, without a step of establishing communicatively the meaning of that duty is probably going to lead to problems, right? So indeed, if you agree to marry someone and you communicate that with that individual, then it would follow there is a certain duty that comes with that agreement, right? Of which you voluntarily entered into. Well, that's quite different than a duty of saying, oh, you're born in America, therefore you have X, Y, and Z duty because you are an American, right? No, maybe that is legitimate in some circumstances, but it would have to be clearly communicated to the people and the terms of it quite clear on why that is the case, because not everyone necessarily agrees on that shared communication, right? So I think on the question of what is more, and here's the other thing. This is not relative, because if we all agree to be at the train station at 2 p.m. tomorrow, then it is objectively wrong not to be at the train station at 2 p.m. tomorrow. It's not relative because we all agreed on that framing of what we need to do, right? Now, maybe it's not as bad as, say, murdering someone or as bad as stealing someone. Then you can get into different degrees of severity. But based on the communication, then we actually do have we can meaningfully talk about right and wrong. This is the other problem. Like right now, nobody wants to talk about right and wrong because they're like, well, I have a different worldview, you have a different religion, I have a different human nature. And that's completely understandable because it's difficult to talk about right and wrong between people of different worldviews. But when you base it on the communicative act, like the act of communication, like a Habermas or something like that, well, that's not relative. We agreed, and we were in the conversation to talk about it. So I think basing what is moral law on communicative acts, on acts of communication, become extremely critical and might be the only way to go about it in a pluralistic age. Oh, well, that means we really need to learn how to talk. That means basically everyone has to be able to negotiate. That means everyone needs to be able to clearly define their terms, and skills like oration and rhetoric become utterly necessary for ethics to be possible. Like this is what could be the stakes here. Like whenever you have a collapse of sociological givens, the only way to make up for that is communication, right? To speak, because the implicit order is not there. Therefore, you only have the explicit. And so the shared implicit order is not there. So all you have is the explicit. So then skills of articulating explicitly the background according to which we are operating becomes utterly necessary, right? So what you're seeing today is basically the impossibility almost of meaningfully discussing ethics without also teaching communicative rationality or the ability to communicate shared backgrounds. And that's a skill set, if you will, that has not needed to have existed for most of human civilization, just simply because people, everyone around you was Christian, everyone around you was Hindu, everyone around you was so on. So the question that you're asking on what constitutes the moral law is going to be extremely tied to ethics games, like language games that Wittgenstein is talking about, and the ability to communicate those things. And it's almost like, and then I'll give it back to you, it's almost like a lot of the advice that they give you for marriage, like communicate in marriage, be slow to anger, understand these things. It's almost like the entire world, almost socially, has to have similar skills when even dealing with just people they just see at work, because of the fact that you have a global village, to use Marshall McLuhan's term, that the whole world is brought in greater proximity and therefore is more likely to bump up against one another, and therefore need to be able to explain why that bumping up wasn't intentional or was an accident or wasn't immoral. Well, all of that then gets us into the realm of communicative rationality.
Yes, that's right. I think it's very interesting that you mentioned language and, the game of languages and communication, because something that I've often said when we discuss philosophy is that at the end of the day, people hear what they want to hear, even if what you're communicating is totally different. And I think that's where there's a fine line between articulating and communicating, because some could argue with technology and globalization, if at all, there is excessive communication. People talk too much, and that is what leads to further conflict. And the example that you gave about meeting at the train station. Now, back in the day, you'd write a letter and, give a time and a date and a place, and you were expected to be there because that was your moral duty to be there, and the other person trusted this individual to be there. However, now it constitutes of a million text messages following up on your ETA or an email, making sure this is happening, or something getting in the way. And I think with most philosophical concepts and ideas, when we discuss whatever the topic is, there is this whole idea of discussing purely for the sake of discussion, where there is a dialogue. However, there isn't a discussion. It's almost ironic. It's a monologue, and I expect you to hear exactly what I'm telling you. You're spoken at instead of spoken to. Yeah. And that is why there is this constant act of rebelling and dismantling existing values or traditions and beliefs, because innately human beings think they're being told what to do. So if you're telling me what to do, then it's wrong because I'm being told to do that. I don't care if it's morally right or wrong. And I think that is a big act of hypocrisy, because yes, especially with the example of marriage, they talk about having to communicate, but then there's also this aspect of, being distinguished or different in your worldviews or your backgrounds or your social economic stances. All of that can be different. And now you sit down and you're supposed to find a middle ground and meet halfway. But then in the equation, there will be an empath and a narcissist to some extent, where one person is more adamant and more outspoken about their needs and wants. And automatically the person on the receiving end will either just be submissive and follow those instructions and agree that's the way we have to go about with dealing about our marriage, or they will rebel against it and say, well, you're not going to tell me what to do. Right. And I think it's very much the case when we discuss the sense of duty that comes with understanding moral law or what is morality. Do people actually have a sense of duty, the role they play, or are they just, purely puppets in this world order that we live in? And I think this comes back to our previous discussion, Daniel, about, critical thinking versus criticism, and how thought is so important, and the way you comprehend your thoughts, and do you actually, live a life of substance and meaning, and do you acknowledge it? And I think that comes with defining all the sort of beliefs that we discussed, whether it's morality, hypocrisy, sense of duty, world order, the community. What is the sense of community in today? What is it? Is there a definition? Is there a sense of compromise? Is there a way where you meet halfway? And I think when you talk about moral hypocrisy, self-deception is what comes to mind. It really is a very prominent theme in the society we live in. Self-deception. You deceive others, and then you deceive yourself in believing what is right and wrong. And if not, you're told by a certain trend online that that's how you should be today, and you just follow it. And I think globalization, and as much as communication is important, I think excessive communication is a fatal flaw and really the bane of modern existence, because we talk too much. And do we talk substance? I suppose not.
Excellent. So a few things. First off,
the claim that you need commutative rationality. One of my critiques, I would say, of Habermas with commutative rationality, which actually is similar to my critique. I don't know if it's a critique, but something I would just say in response to, say, Hunter's claim that we need substantive democracy. That means a lot. Like, that means a whole lot. It sounds simple, but to say, oh, we have to be able to replace the loss of givens with a shared intelligibility established upon communication, that is way, 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 way harder than it sounds, because people often they're engaged in self-deception. Like, you have to have meta talks. It's not merely saying what you want. Like, if I say I want X, you say I want Y, we've communicated, but that's not going to do anything, right? We also have to share a worldview where the world is not so much a place of problems and solutions, but trade-offs. We have to understand that difference is inherently valuable. So another problem is you can't have like a substantive democracy if you believe in autonomous rationality, because everyone who's different from you doesn't share your rationality and therefore is false. And it's always immoral, epistemically immoral, to compromise with falsity, right? So this point that we're making actually leads into all of thoughts, all of conflict of mind, and basically every, I mean, it does, because because the moment you say that human beings have to actively create between themselves the shared background upon which the ethical can meaningfully be defined, that requires an entirely different metaphysical conception of what it means to be in the world. So everything changes with that move. It sounds like a simple move, and you hear all the time, like the whole conflict of mind book emerged, all these people saying, oh, we need to compromise. Well, what does that mean exactly? Like, that's not so simple. Like, if we say, oh, we need to value diversity. What does that mean? Do you want to have diversity with like conspiracy theorists or people who are like radical terrorists or something, right? Nobody means that they want unlimited diversity. They mean they want reasonable diversity, right? Or diversity within a certain limit, right? Okay, what constitutes that limit? Well, now everything it gets crazy all of a sudden, right? So the point that you're getting at cannot be overstressed, because if you ask questions about ethics and morality, you end up having to talk about commutative rationality and then ergo substantive democracy. And the moment you get there, then you poke on that a little bit, bam, like everything explodes. And you have to really think through basically everything in many different ways. Now, that's where thoughts exist. That's where the truism of the rational exists. That's where belonging again exists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This problem is extremely severe and deep. Now, on the problem on hypocrisy, I generally like to talk more about irony than hypocrisy. The reason is because nobody experiences themselves as a hypocrite. If you did, you wouldn't do it, or it would be much more difficult to do it unless you were a sociopath. Most people, if they feel that they're being hypocritical, feel bad about it and don't do it very much, right? So in order to hypocrisy is something we tend to see in other people, right? But not ourselves. But you see, since most people do not meaningfully engage in hypocrisy, what they tend to do is engage in irony or ignorance or not paying attention, some other sort of characteristic, right? Irony is where you do X, believing that will get you Y, and actually because you do X, that's why you don't get Y, right? So like irony, for example, would be what can happen is people like claim that they care about love, and then they proceed to do something that they think is loving that the other person interprets as hateful. And then that person says, you're a hypocrite. You said you cared about love and you actually don't, right? Well, that's not really what occurred. It was more irony, meaning that the person did what they thought was loving, but actually was precisely what led to the person not feeling love, right? So irony tends to be a description, but what that would mean is that in order, therefore, to kind of deal with human beings, you have to think in terms of irony, the fact that we tend to fall into irony without meaning to, and like you said, self-deception, right? Well, self-deception only works if you don't think you're self-deceived, because if you thought you were self-deceived, then you're not self-deceived, right? So even like self-deception is something we see in other people, but not ourselves, which of course means is useless, because if I accuse someone of being self-deceptive, since they did not experience themselves as self-deceptive, they won't understand what I'm saying. Well, that means we then have to figure out the phenomenology of self-deception, how to find it in ourselves, how to identify it, which is remarkably difficult by definition, because self-deception only works if you don't think you're self-deceived. So how do you know if you're self-deceived? Well, things gets nuts, right? So what's being pointed at is, if you take seriously this need for commutative rationality, it opens an entire toolbox of problems and different things that have to be worked through that basically classical moral theory does not provide us the tools with, in my opinion. And that's the problem we find ourselves in. We just simply don't have moral theory that is updated, if you will, by which to deal with these problems. Like the key with religions is they tended to give you stories. Like, yeah, there's the Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus gives you stories of how he interacts with tax collectors. And really, actually, I would say that basically literature is now a much more useful enterprise for determining ethical and moral life than a lot of the old classical moral treatise, because literature are stories that then you get notions and models from that you can apply to daily life. Like, there's a lot more use now almost in reading, say, a Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or a Jane Austen, or I could go on, then a lot of times I'm reading these old categories, because we need now that personal conditionality and that thinking through the personal situations by which to operate.
I agree, Daniel. That's very true. And I think in the end of the day, what one really requires is true ethical character. And however you define that, a sense of self-existence and self-awareness is what eventually defines moral value or morality in your respective world. And like I said earlier, I think the lack of character is what sort of creates this conflicted, confused versions of hypocrisy, and you are indirectly, almost ironically, being hypocritical in the way you approach society and your community and even your better half in marriage, because you have this lack of character even though you think you do have a character. And that's why it's so important to be conscientious and reflect and read thoughts. That's why we need to read thoughts and sort of question our mind and our existence. And I think there is less questioning of that and more questioning of what can be changed than what can be changed within us, or rather embrace. Because if you can acknowledge yourself as a hypocrite, that's, one for starters. You're getting somewhere if you see yourself as a hypocrite. And I think in the end of the day, I really do resonate with Hegel's idea of moral hypocrisy being a way of self-deception, because that's very evident in politics and, the way the world's run and the way people live their lives. Sometimes you're in self-denial almost. And that also brings in Plato's noble lie, because you convince yourself to do something which you're influenced to do without even knowing whether it's the right thing for you or your family or the society you live in, or an active contribution to the society you live in, really. You were going to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, and then I know you have to run. I've enjoyed this
tremendously. What we learned from Socrates is that basically to think, you have to believe you know nothing. Like Socrates knows he knows nothing, right? And that's why he's the smartest man, because everyone else knows nothing but don't know they know nothing, right? So Socrates is the smartest because he knows nothing. Right. I will definitely say that what is foundational for moral life is genuinely believing that you are prone to hypocrisy and self-deception and irony and things like that. Like, one of the great benefits of, say, Christianity was genuinely believing that, hey, everyone's fallen, everyone's a sinner. Like, a lot of religions have this language of fallenness, separation of God. And right there, that means embedded in the psychotechnology is a mechanism of always questioning yourself. Now, never did it perfectly, but that little notion of always being self-skeptical morally is utterly paramount. And the moment you lose that, you're basically doomed, right? This whole communicative rationality structure that requires all of these other issues to go into, because like you say, the world is full of conversation, but it's different in quality and problematic ways, different in kind. Well, all of that will only work if all people involved genuinely believe that they're prone to self-deception, hypocrisy, and different things like that, right? Because that becomes a shared humility as a foundation that makes possible to receive what other people say, right? And so on and so forth. So in the way that for intellectual life, you must start from a place of truly believing you know nothing, so you see in moral life the necessity of really truly believing that you're prone to be immoral, precisely because of good intention not being good, hermeneutical differences, the way the mind works to self-deceive itself, so on and so forth. That is a really necessary starting place. And I think without that, basically, the chances of duty going in the way that Hegel's describing, the chances of love not being unintentionally hurtful, all those different things, the chances of not making those mistakes becomes much lower. But if you come from a place of understanding this tendency to be problematic unintentionally, then you can do better. But it's hard to do better if you already think you're better. So it's good to believe that you're not better, and that gives you some room to grow.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Daniel. As always, you've shed some light and put me out of my misery. Thank you.
Well,
do you want to tell us a little bit about belonging?
Oh gosh, belonging again? Oh, well, you're kind, Sandy. It's coming out soon, May 12th. And actually, I was going to say yeah, well, there we go. A lot of the topic of character is actually exactly where this has to go. And a lot of Belonging again will actually describe, say, what is character today with a collapse of sociological givens, say in terms of absolute knowing in Hegel, the Nietzschean child comparing that with the Deleuzian individual, Jesus and the Grand Inquisitor of Dostoevsky. So this question of character, which would then, of course, be embodied determinations, according to necessities, say in the philosophy of right, that all becomes very important. So hopefully we'll come out soon if I don't lose my mind beforehand. So we'll see.
Well, you've already lost your mind, Daniel.
Thank you, Sandy. You're right, actually.
You would accept it to begin with. You're being a little hypocritical. We just
You're
discussed
right.
accepting our vices.
But you see, if I lost my mind, I don't have a mind to know that I lost it. So is it really hypocrisy, or is it simply the tragedy of us?
Oh, I guess it's both.
Yes, a little bit.
Thank you very much for having this conversation with me, Daniel. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
It's always a pleasure, Sanduni. I hope you have a wonderful one. Thank you for your time, my dear.
And you.